So welcome everybody. Hold on, let me just go continue. Just to let you know, we are recording this so that people can access, who weren't able to attend but were interested, can access the presentation. Abhi, next slide. I keep thinking I can advance it. So by way of introductions, because not everybody knows us, I'm Pat Arean. I'm a professor in the Department of Psychiatry and Behavioral Sciences at the University of Washington and the director of the University of Washington Alacrity Center. Our center is focused on increasing access, quality, and usability of psychosocial treatments for mental health problems in underserved communities. And I have spent the past 10 years conducting research using digital technology as a means of reaching difficult populations and increasing access to care.
And I'm Abhi. I work as a principal scientist in digital health at Sage Networks. It's a small nonprofit in Seattle. And my area of focus has been neuropsychiatric research, essentially developing ways and means in which we can gather real-world experiences of people that could potentially develop real-world evidence of disease biomarkers in the future. And some of my recent projects have been around assessing cognition in the real world. We are working with NIA on that and also involved in the Precision Medicine Initiative, All of Us project with NIH.
So just by way of overview, what we're going to be covering today is our first part of the presentation is how to make the decision to transfer over from an in-person study to a remote study. I know that some of you are probably on here because you're concerned about the recent pandemic and how that is affecting your ability to conduct research that has been ongoing, that was in person and now needs to be paused. And so we'll spend a little bit of time on that because I also know that there are a number of you who are on this seminar who are just really interested in taking advantage of mobile technology to conduct some rapid research, potentially around the impact of COVID on a variety of situations. And so we'll talk about what remote assessment looks like, what you need to know about remote data collection, its management, including data security, the best places and ways to recruit participants, and then what to expect in general, and a little bit about what to expect in a pandemic, just by way of a teaser. People are pretty motivated to participate in COVID studies, so I'll talk about that a little bit. And then obviously, if you're doing this research remotely where you don't have contact with the individual, how do you do consent? We won't spend a lot of time on general IRB practices, like how to get your proposal through an IRB. We're thinking about hosting another webinar about that, but we're trying to identify the right people to have that conversation. And then most important, we're going to be talking about best retention practices for participants, because this is the type of research where you can recruit a lot of people and most of them drop out early.
Can you put it in and out, okay?
And if you guys can mute yourself, that would be great. We actually did not set us up so that you all came unmuted. Next slide.
All right, so this should be obvious to everyone at this point. We are going and probably will be a new normal for some time. And what does that mean for research? And I think some of the guidelines has actually come from, sorry, I'm hearing a lot of background. If everyone can mute themselves, that'll be lovely. Thank you. The guidance have already come from a lot of regulatory agencies, both in US and Europe, and particularly for mental health. It's pretty interesting on how the regulations have evolved over time in terms of using software as a medical device, which is the official term for a mental health app, which is trying to assess and intervene, where FDA has even made 510K pre-market notifications. That has a lot of consequences on if you're trying to develop and deploy an intervention, but even for assessment. And I highly recommend these as potential good links to sort of review what the short-term changes in regulations are. And if you are short on time, then assuming you can follow my pointer here, the Clinical Transformation Initiative guidance is the best one out there. It's very short and crisp and sort of takes you to the high-level messages and then goes into more gory details via links.
So let's move to deciding, for those of you who are curious about what the impact is going to be on your research, to shift methods. Next slide. So here are some things to consider. If you're early on in the research process, that's actually ideal because it will impact very few of your existing participants if you have to do research, switch to a remote platform. However, once you do switch, it's not ideal to switch back because you are actually using very different platforms for assessment, treatment, and so forth. If you are mid-study, you will need to document a switch as a time-varying indicator in your statistical model. So very much make sure you know exactly when people started to switch over and document that so your statistician can manage that in the data analysis. If you have a control group, so for instance, you're doing a randomized clinical trial, this helps control a bit for the impact of switching because everybody, your controls and your experimental groups are going through the same challenge of having to switch over. If the sample is large enough, you can analyze the cohorts for differences. So there's a lot that you can do and what's really cool about this kind of research is you can actually reach way more people than you could if you do this research remotely. We'll talk about that in a little bit. But the decision is really going to vary from study to study. And I would say the best answer to the question, should I switch, is to talk to your methodologist and your biostats person because they can tell you what the consequences are going to be analytically in terms of you having to switch. So now we're moving on to the nuts and bolts of remote research. And I will say, as a disclaimer, we are going to show as examples and talk a little bit about different platforms that are available for use. This is in no way an endorsement of those products. It's really just as an example, an FYI, but we do not, we're not getting any money from these companies, and we certainly are not saying, these are the best out there. They're really just examples to get you started.
Awesome. So just to set the stage, and I'm probably stating the obvious here, but it's pretty important to understand the difference in where the studies will work in terms of assessing someone in the real world and the opportunities that it brings, right? So all the ubiquitous devices we have, from smartphones to our tablets to even computers, which could be used for assessment also, really allow researchers to sort of probe people at different frequencies, much more at a higher cadence compared to what you could do in the clinic. And so the opportunity sort of shows up in a way that you can either design a fully remote study or have an in-clinic component to it, or a virtual face-to-face check-in. So there are different ways in which you can blend that together. But one thing to understand in this is you can and will capture a lot more data and noise, and we will go into some of those details in a bit. Also, it's important to see if you're designing a study which is sort of smartphone-based, and we will also distinguish web-based versus smartphone-based. I'm going to highlight there is a minority population that is not just Blacks and Hispanic, but also white, that are only using smartphones as a medium to access web. That's pretty important. If you are able to assess them maybe for the first time through remote measures, they might not be either otherwise accessible in normal trials. The other aspect of this is, which is basically the starting point, is you have understood what you're trying to ask, what's your primary endpoint or secondary endpoint in terms of the questions. Another question becomes how you will deploy that through technology, and there are various options available. This is by no means exhaustive, but just to sort of binarize that, the first and foremost, the easier one is to have a web-based sort of survey that could be deployed through the existing technology that many of us are aware, such as RedCap. So stating the obvious there, it also has some new modules for mobile pluggability that could be explored. So it's sort of already there with some more bells and whistles. There is obviously the case for even having a face-to-face assessment, which could be a pseudo virtual clinic visit that you could design in your protocol via Zoom or similar technology. Then there are platforms like Survey Gizmo, which not only act as deployment of surveys, but they have more capabilities to even randomize your cohort into different arms without you having to do it manually or having a secondary sort of interface to do that. So as you design and think of a platform, think of all the consequences that it might have. And I will detail a little more in a bit. The other aspect of this is, let's go smartphone based. And so this is more powerful in terms of what you can do, but it also has a higher cost and higher time in terms of the initial time to start. There are majority two frameworks that are available, which is one is iOS Research Kit, which was launched 5 years ago, and the corresponding counterpart in Android called Research Stack. At a very high level, these are just development libraries. Your app doesn't need to follow these, but if they do, then you have some design guidelines as well as some frameworks and modules available that you can plug and play. Think of this as building on top of a Lego platform, right? So you might have some Lego blocks available already that you can leverage. There are also various open source platforms, and this ecosystem is growing. Again, no endorsements, just listing few, including our own that Pat will talk about, which is Brighton research app. And they all have different varying capabilities of letting a researcher design a study with some coding to without coding. And there's always an asterisk attached to that because this is still work in progress. The other extreme of data collection is the passive monitoring, which can take its own webinar. So I'm not going to go into all the details, but think of capturing someone's lived experience in the wild through how much they're walking, how much they're talking through on their phones, etc. Might be useful in certain disease areas, not everywhere. And then also wearable integration. So you have the capability to have sort of a bring your own device, such as Fitbit or Garmin, where you can ingest data from those, which will give you a lot of data, but it's also thinking about how does it map onto the underlying disease constructs that you are interested in. Again, once you capture this lot of data, which comes from various streams, various data frequency and volume, you have to think about it in your design phase of the study on how you will integrate all these multiple data modalities together. Things are much more simpler if the goal is to deploy a survey, but if you get your number of data modalities higher, so there is a survey that is deployed, there is passive data that is being captured, etc., the more complicated you have to think about in the sense of what's the analytical framework in which this data will be collected, featureized, where is it coming from, what's the provenance of that, and what my inference goals are. And while doing all of this, it's super important to think about privacy and security in this day and age, right? And what I mean by that is, at a very high level, it's important to understand what are you trying to ask and what of that component have PHI or PII linkage to it, and how will that impact your IRB, as well as the need for HIPAA or even a higher order of security compliance called FISMA. These can take a lot of time to discuss, so I've put a link on the slides and that will be shared. And lastly, which is very simple but sometimes forgotten on this side, is how do you manage data movement from the participant-facing tool, no matter whether it's an app or a survey that is deployed through Survey Gizmo, etc., and the data movement back to your researcher hands, right? It needs to be end-to-end encrypted. It's almost like a free feature, but sometimes it's ignored, which is something that we should not be doing.
So now we're going to talk about recruitment, and I'm going to talk about that right here in terms of the different ways that you could reach a large swath of the population. So obviously social media is one platform that you can use. So for instance, Facebook, Instagram, Twitter all have a means of reaching to populations that you may be interested in recruiting. We're currently using Facebook ads for a study where we are asking people to download an app to track, basically the original purpose of the study was to track the outbreak of flu and colds, but then COVID happened and we pivoted, well, we added questions about whether or not, people had certain types of symptoms. And this is actually a really good way to recruit a certain population, because when we get Facebook, we do tend to get more of an older population. If you use Twitter or some of the other social media platforms, you'll get a much younger population. And just to give you an idea, it's not free, but if it's kind of an interesting payment model. You basically put an ad up and you pay per click. So every time somebody clicks on your ad, there's a certain amount that Facebook gets back, and this is the same with Google ads as well. However, the more clicks you get, the less you pay. And so, as an example, at one period of time in this study, we're currently we've been running for about 3 weeks. We currently have 5,000 people enrolled, but at one point we had 1,300 clicks. Oh, I'm sorry, we had 1,000 clicks. And at that point, it was 35 cents per click. When it went up by about 300 people to 1,300 clicks, it was 32 cents. So the more you get clicks, the cheaper it gets. And so it's not expensive, but it's probably more expensive than you would anticipate for a regular face-to-face recruitment. Craigslist is free. And it actually was the method that we used in the Brighton study, which we're going to be talking about in a second. This was by far our best recruitment avenue. One of the advantages of Craigslist is that it is free, it is national. Lots of people hit Craigslist. And the challenge, though, is opposed to when we did the Brighton study, where we basically could open up in any city. Craigslist actually makes you wait and only put like the same ad in a couple of cities. There's some policy around that as to why I think it helps them make sure that there isn't some scam happening, right? So you do have to do your recruitment in waves, but you can reach a lot of communities that you wouldn't normally be able to reach if you were trying to do this either through Facebook or through regular, avenues like ads and so forth. MTurk is good. This is an Amazon product. It is good if you want to do one-off surveys. You can do longitudinal surveys, but it's a little bit more challenging. We have used MTurk in that process. MTurk was created as a marketing tool, and so you can do a lot of interesting things beyond surveys. You can do conjoint analyses, you can do A/B testing, which is basically comparing product A to product B and seeing which people, what products people like. The price of recruiting for MTurk, there's the minimal. I think the minimal amount of money you can pay somebody for a survey is $5. They don't have it timed, so it's just per survey. And then there's an additional cost for Amazon to distribute those funds. But this can be a really quick way. In fact, just to give you an example, we were able to do a couple of studies this way, recruiting, and our maximum, we said we wanted 1,000 people. We got 1,000 people in 2 days. And so that could be a really cool resource. And then there's obviously the local resources. I find if you can get into the news, that it'll always generate an awful lot of traffic to your study. And I don't mean advertisements. I mean like, an article in a paper or a news story. You do get this giant bolus of people participating at the beginning, but then it starts to taper off. And, if you can do something like that quarterly, that can be really helpful. Hold on, we've got a comment here, how to budget for Facebook ads, considering that the amount of charges with each click. Let me address that at the end. In fact, we have somebody who's keeping track of the chat comments so that we can address them, but I will get to that, you bet. So the Brighton study, this was a project that was, I think now, it might be 7 years old. It doesn't feel that way. We conducted 2 fully remote randomized clinical trials for assessing and mediating depression. And the purpose of the study originally was to just test the feasibility of doing a remote clinical trial. Our original sample size that we projected to recruit was 150 people. We reached that in a day. And then quickly pivoted, got permission to move forward to just let a recruitment happen to the maximum that we could afford. And in this study, what we did was, as I mentioned, we tested a lot of different recruitment avenues, and we do have this study published in British Medical Journal Innovations, BMJ Innovations. I can send the link to that article for anybody who's interested, because in the supplemental materials, we talk about the cost of recruiting this way based on the different avenues of recruitment that we utilized. People basically hit our website, did a screening and consent, and then were randomized to download one of 3 apps for depression, and then participated for 12 weeks where we did remote monitoring using this platform called Ginger.io. They don't do that anymore, and so just FYI. But that was the platform we used for passive sensing and also for administering daily and weekly surveys. We screened 7,000 people and enrolled 2,000 people. And as you can see on this map, we screened people from all over the United States. And although some states didn't result in enrollment, and you'll see that a lot of them are fairly rural states where there were probably issues around broadband, we did get a very representative sample. Next slide. If you want to do targeted recruitment, this was an example of where when we did our first wave of Brighton, we got a large sample very quickly. And I forgot to mention that we did the recruitment in 5 one-week waves. And that's how we were able, so basically over the course of 5 weeks, you know, that was the number of people with depression that we were able to reach. We did notice that when we were looking at our demographics that we were almost identical to we were pretty much identical to the CDC, oh, no, I'm sorry, the US Census estimates for demographics, you know, ethnic minorities, age groups, and so forth, except for one demographic, which were Latinos. And so we did a second study in Spanish, and we were able to use specialized, we originally saw that it was very hard to get, even though we did the study in Spanish, it was still very hard to reach this population. And so, but we started to get a lot of traffic after we did some accommodations to our website. So for instance, we had 2 doctors who are both bicultural, bilingual, explain the purpose of the study. They focus a lot on community building, how important, you know, first it is that a lot of people have depression in our community and they don't have access to a doctor, how important it is to participate in this study for our community because we need interventions that help us. And we also did target community outlets. So for instance, you would be surprised at how willing a lot of Spanish-speaking news channels are willing and eager actually to interview people for on important topics like, for instance, COVID or depression. And so we did, or one of our colleagues, Joaquina Angara, did an interview with Telemundo. But there's a lot of Latino news outlets that you could just, you know, pretty much approach, and they'll be very interested in interviewing you. Next slide. Oh, did you play?
Right.
Okay. I don't know if you can.
Millones de personas hispano-latinas en los Estados Unidos. Más de 15% tuvieron problemas con el estado de ánimo.
I'm going to stop it here, Pat. I think this just shows the video that was created rather than running through the whole one.
Right, and it's a little bit messed up. So sorry about that. But if you guys want to see the video, we have it and we can share it with you. So the next point, obviously, you know, once you recruit, you have to have a way to consent. And so we're going to be talking about this a little bit, which is that you don't want to just do what you do normally in a face-to-face trial and just expect it to work on the internet or or on a smartphone. It's a very different interaction with your participant. And one of the big challenges is that you don't have an opportunity to sit down and answer participants' questions. So you have to do that for them and be proactive. You always want to make the PDF of the full consent form that your IRB approved downloadable. So lots of people, you'd be surprised, download them and want to keep them because they want to know who to contact and what exactly is going on. But you have also a lot of other people who tend to do the terms and conditions kind of behavior where you just click and move forward because you want to just get started. So it's really important to like put a little bit of a barrier between like starting the study and reading the consent just to make sure they understand what they're getting into. And so you need to make the crucial elements of participation very clear. It's useful to have frequently asked questions about participation. We in the Brighton study use videos to explain the study, but not everybody does that. You can do that very easily with some very simple screenshots. And then what's really critical here is the use of a consent quiz. This is actually from research colleagues of mine have done assessing whether or not a participant, like say somebody who has mild cognitive impairment, understands that they're participating in a study, and we just transferred that onto a digital platform. So here's an example, next slide, Abhi, from the Brighton website. And so you can see that you just want to make it very consumable. It's not a full consent form. It's just like what the study's about, how the study works, you know, how long it lasts, what the risks and benefits are. And then we have the eligibility screen we do first, and then the consent form. And then just to show you, and this is basically how we ask questions. So they're very fundamental. I am a volunteer in this study, true or false. There's no clinician monitoring how I'm doing in this study, true or false. You know, the purpose of the study is to figure out how to collect information about depression from smartphones, true or false. And the purpose of this is not to screen people out. It's really to make sure they understand what they're participating in. So even if they get the questions wrong because they didn't pay attention to the previous screens, we give them an opportunity to know that, like, you know, actually you got that wrong. This is the purpose of the study, and then they can take the consent quiz again.
All right, so now we'll jump to the other side of it. So now you have recruited people, consented them, and now you want to keep them in the study for however the duration of the study is, and ideally as long as possible, and you want to enrich that. However, the research is pretty grim in terms of what is the underlying patterns in the digital health access and utilization. And I'm going to summarize a very recent paper that I recently completed along with Pat and a few others, which goes into probing this little further in terms of the past 5 or 8 studies that we had access to with about 100,000 people. Unfortunately, I will have not enough time to go through all the details, but I would recommend you look at the paper if you're interested and even follow up with me. Happy to talk about it. So at the recruitment level, we try to compare it to the state-wise with respect to US population of that state across all the 8 studies. So it's non-exhaustive, but it's a good sort of ballpark sense of where things stand. And the US map here basically shows the recruitment with proportion to state population, whether it's over or under recruited, and it's pretty clear what's going on, right? The Southern and the upper Midwest has some issues in terms of people accessing and utilizing these research studies. So for example, if you were designing an obesity study, and you should be concerned about this map because your recruitment efforts need to be focused on the southern part of the country, which is very well known to unfortunately have the highest obesity rates. So that's the take-home message from just putting a study out without thinking through the recruitment plan is probably not the best idea for come all, get all. It's not working. The other related part to this is we continue to sort of oversample the white and undersample the minorities. If the study is sort of targeted towards general population of the US, then there's a problem, right? However, if you have a target cohort in mind and you are representing or able to represent that in your study, that's fine. Not every study needs to map out to the US population. It just depends on your target cohort and make sure that you're sort of going at it in a precision manner. The other aspect of this is, are people really willing to participate and share their data? And so we did a recent MTurk-based study. MTurk is the same sort of thing that Pat talked about a few slides earlier. The goal here was to recruit a large enough sample matching to the demographics of US, and then over time probe them on 2 key constructs, whether they are willing to participate and share. And this is in the backdrop of the Cambridge Analytica fiasco that happened last year, along with many other data breaches that were infamous for in 2019. It's just crazy in terms of how many data leaks happen in healthcare. So the key take-home message in those two probes were most people, a majority, are willing to participate in a study run by universities, which is interesting, compared to pharma, for example, and there is even a drastic, significant drop over time indicated by these. On the other side, who is willing to share data? The good news is we did not observe any significant socio-demographic differences. However, less than 50% of the sample across the board were willing to share, and the highest being with university. So the take home on this part is if you want to recruit 500 people, you have to reach out to a pretty large sample. So there's a funnel effect going on, and that needs to be really addressed in your recruitment. The why behind what's happening is also super important to understand. And this is representative themes. So people do not trust or respect some of the companies that are involved, and this is based on what they said. And they are very wary of issues like Cambridge Analytica fiasco, where the data was unappropriately handled by companies. The next aspect of this is to understand what's the retention look like based on the past research. So what data is telling us rather than just what we think it might be. And so I'll present you some use cases based on data. So there are 8 studies. That's why there are 8 lines in this survival curve. Y-axis is the proportion of the sample that lasts in a study based on how much time, and that's covered on the X-axis. And the take home on this is 50% of the participants in fully remote research studies are dropping out in the first 5 to 10 days. There is a silver lining here, at least for one study, and we'll go into that in a bit, which is the Brighton study, and that has to do, at least one aspect of that is incentive-based. There are also subtle differences. Most of the studies were non-interventional, although Brighton was interventional. So there could be other aspects also going around. This one is a little involved, but just at the very high level, what's going on is if you wait for certain days, which is about a week or couple of days, you see a drastic increase in your median survival time of the cohort. Now, what this means for a study design perspective is if you have an RCT that you are planning, it actually might be a good idea to have a cool-off period or run-in period, whatever you want to call that, for first few days. So you basically let the cohort enrich for people who actually will be willing to participate. This will increase the power of detection in what you're trying to go after, but this will not get around the bias that the data will still have. So you will still need to articulate that, control for it, but at least you have a better powered study than what you would have started otherwise. And when I say bias, let's look at that, right? So similar curves on the survival plots here, but this time comparing across the cohort differences in participation by age. So older population is actually sticking for significantly longer. If you look at the 25 percentile here, which is this line, there's almost double the difference in number of days the participants remain in the study. What this means is if you're interested in recruiting young population, the communication and the focus has to be on retaining that cohort through various mechanisms that Pat will talk about in a minute. The second aspect of this was there were many different kinds of studies. Some had healthy population and some had disease that was of interest to the study, and there's a drastic difference in the engagement rates for these populations. And this is a pretty large sample, by the way, so it's non-exhaustive, but still gives you what the baseline is. And if the study is going after a case control analysis in any disease, I think the goal has to be also on engaging the healthy cohort, because at the end of the day, you might not have enough data to compare or do a fair comparison, or you'll have to cut short your cohort to do age matching, et cetera, et cetera. And one of the key message we got from our analysis here was there was sub-cohort in the 2 studies out of the 8 where people were recruited through light clinical referral. So this was not where a clinician was involved directly in the study and getting data back and changing any care at all. So that's not the point. We were partnering with the studies were partnering with some clinical sites, and the clinicians were just handing out a light referral to a study. And that showed a huge change in terms of the order of magnitude in terms of how many days people are engaged in a study. So in future, I think one of the very good signs this is showing is if it comes from your doctor, you probably will listen more.
Which perhaps we could start seeing and talk.
Sorry, I could not hear the question. Could you please repeat?
I just keep going. I think that was an accidental.
Okay. Before we jump on to the next section, I think I'll suffice to say that super important is for researchers to really think through on what should be asked, what the social affordance of it in terms of participants' life, if the context is important for when to ask it, and how many times you should ask it. So there needs to be a really thought given to the study protocol, so it's as parsimonious, meeting the needs of both researchers and the end users. Pat?
Sorry about that. I was on mute. So moving on to retention strategies, I'm going to talk about a bunch of different kinds of strategies that are important for remote research engagement, given what Abhi, was talking about in terms of the challenges. I will say, and I'm not going to spend I'm going to talk about this right now, is that one of the best strategies is, as much as possible, if you can afford it, human contact is best. And so as an example, chatbot, having some kind of interaction with your participant that, around troubleshooting, reminders and all of that, having a human being, there's research to show that that does amp up the retention of participation in things like digital mental health or digital health tools. And the same is true for research. So for instance, in one study that we're conducting right now, we have an interface where we've got a full-time RA. She's working right now with about 4,000 people, and she fields a lot of the questions and comments that come up, but at the same time, can also be a real person to do a reminder. Chatbots are really nice, and that's one way to go. However, chatbot technology is not at the place where people can't figure out that they're not talking to somebody. So there are some really beautiful chatbots out there, I will say. However, they're expensive and they run on very sophisticated algorithms. And so if you can afford to have a human being who can actually do an email or text back and forth, that usually helps quite a bit with retention, or can. We're studying that right now. So if we one of the big things we want to think about though is usability of your tool. So next slide. Basically, you want to invoke principles of user-centered design. And one of the challenges is that if you want to get going right now, that can be really challenging. But you can actually do user-centered design on a very small sample of people. So we have a webinar that we did 2 weeks ago that Emily Friedman led, where she talks about, remote user-centered design research methods. But really what you need to do is think very carefully about what is the survey going to look like on the phone or on the internet. It is a lot harder to do a survey for 45 minutes on your computer as opposed to talking to somebody and doing a survey, right? Because at least the human interaction, the research assistant can gauge how you're doing, are you tired, can field questions, and it's not as laborious. So you really want to think about, what kind of burden am I imposing on my participant? I'm not really there to help hold their hand. And so if you want to keep people retained, you probably want to test out and ask questions about things like, if you're doing ecological momentary assessments or daily assessments, when is the best time to do that, to send an assessment? How many assessments do you think they can tolerate? And please don't base it on studies that have been done on in the past with small groups of people where they've actually had human contact at some point, because that will not replicate to scale. Next slide. And so this is an example of our Brighton app right now that has actually undergone a lot of user testing. What I mean by that is that we created a lot of different, these are called wireframes, and we presented them to groups of people online to basically pick which interface they preferred. And that's everything from the color to the layout to even the little cute graphic that came up, and that is now Brighton, to develop Brighton's personality. So in this case, we are pretty fully remote in this particular project. And so what we try to do is create, in the next slide, a really, Abhi, next slide. A really nice interface for how to do assessments. So you can see there's really big radio buttons on the second version. There's a really nice chat interface, and we had decided to use a text-based kind of chat interface as our way to do the surveys, because that is how people use their phones. And so rather than throwing a survey up there with radio buttons, it was a lot easier to do it this way. People found this way more engaging and useful. In terms of incentives, if you don't have a big budget, you can invoke non-monetary incentives such as this. So I'm showing you actually screenshots from an app. This is an intermittent fasting app. It uses principles that we used in a big study for depression in a project that I consulted on. And the team that created that study also used user-centered design to test this out for people with depression. It was really fascinating. And so what happens here is that, and I'll explain the intermittent fasting app. So the first screenshot on the left in front of you is basically what happens when you don't meet your goal, right? And so to use an analogy, if you don't do all of your assessments for the week, you still get feedback. You're still told that you're awesome, thanks for participating, but that's all you get, right? In the second screenshot on your right in front of you, this is what happens when you complete all of your assessments. You get a cute GIF that basically this is animated, and then every time you do that, you get a different GIF. What we found in the other study with depression is that people found this super engaging. They looked forward to completing their survey so they could see, Jean-Luc Picard clapping, or, SpongeBob doing a funny dance. So this actually, using this strategy, we actually, we also were looking at financial incentives, so it's a little hard to tease out the non-monetary from the financial, but we had really good engagement in that particular study. Next slide. You can also use social incentives, and this is an example from a UNICEF app where basically teaches you to go without your phone, and then if you can not use your phone for 10 minutes, it equals 1 day of clean water for children in need. And so there's that social incentive that, for instance, if you were to do this for a COVID study, and given the fact that a lot of people are very motivated to help researchers right now around this pandemic because they all want to leave their homes, you could set this up to be for every survey you complete, it equals another minute that you can spend outside, or help another, or it could be like a small donation to make sure that there's enough finances for a low-income community to be able to do testing. So that's sort of the idea, is that you're participating to help other people. Next slide. The leaderboards are also useful, although they do appeal to a very specific population, and you have to be careful if you're doing mental health research or research where you're treating a condition that is, by its nature, the intervention is somewhat punishing. So weight loss is one to think of. Leaderboards can work if you have a fairly competitive group of people that you're interested in, and they like the idea of, who's going to win. Now, it's a little hard with assessment to say, who's the leader if everybody's, doing their assessments in a timely fashion. But you could create leaderboards in terms of, completing sessions, or doing physical, activity that would help, help help with like a health condition. And there are different kinds. There's the one on the left is from Fitbit. It's basically you compared to other people in terms of the number of steps you've made. The one on the right is from Duolingo. They use a lot of behavioral economics, which I'm going to talk about in a second, where you, based on how many times you practice your new language, you can get a certain number of gems, and you get into a particular kind of league, and here are all the other people and where you stand compared to them. Next slide. Behavioral economics is essentially a combination of psychological theory, in essence, reinforcement theory, with economics theories. And here, these are two examples of apps that use behavioral economics. I will go ahead and say that I know I'm aware of one platform in healthcare at the University of Pennsylvania. They have, it's called Way to Health. And I'll make sure that you guys get a link to that. They can use behavioral economics, and they have it set up and can help you guide you through how to use a behavioral economics model to keep people incentivized in digital research or health research. But the basic premise is that, and you can do it two ways. In this way, what both Duolingo and Chore Monster does is that you earn points. In the case of Duolingo, you earn points based on how many streaks you over the week you have of practicing your new language, because they know that in order to be proficient in a language, you have to practice it every day. If you break that streak, your health kind of goes down. However, if you really want to move on to the next level, you can earn these points. I don't know, Abhi, if you could scroll over the blue gems, on Duolingo on the right, on the left, sorry. Yeah, so you can use these gems to purchase passes to keep going, to practice your language. But obviously but it's interesting, the more mistakes you make in your language, the fewer health points you have, and the more you have to rely on your gems to kind of keep practicing. Chore Monster is a similar method. And I put this up there largely because there's probably people who have little kids at home that they would love to help out with the chores. And again, I'm not endorsing this, but it's also uses this really cool principle where you can set up tasks for instance, your participant or your kid to do things that are worth a certain amount of points. And those points, basically are worth a certain number of tickets. So if you see the green legend down on the app screen, 70 stars, that's the points, equals 2 tickets that you can use in the monster store to buy monsters. So it's sort of this idea of like reinforcement theory, helping, motivate you. There's also gamification models, which I have not used before, so I'm not going to talk to about them explicitly, but just so you know, they do exist as well. And that's another principle of variable reinforcement, sort of like a gambling criteria, that the harder you work, makes you work harder to get, certain points. However, all of those things that I just talked about assumes that you have the budget and the time to develop these really nice, cool tools, and that you have a population that has access to smartphones that can, utilize that. So you may have to rely on financial incentives, and Abhi's going to talk about that in a little bit. I don't know that there's one good rule of thumb for how much you should pay somebody. I will tell you that in the Brighton study, people could earn $75 for participating for 12 weeks. And we were able to keep in a little over half of the sample over that 12-week period of time. In another study, a much larger incentive, like $130, kept 80 people, about 75 to 80% of the sample in the study. However, that's a lot of money, right? So you might want to think about a combination of financial incentives, and on SMS, you can emulate some of the ideas behind behavioral economics or social incentives or non-monetary incentives, by using emojis instead of GIFs, or using text to say, thank you, you've just helped us, screen X number of people, or, get us back on track, so that we can all go outside again. Your turn, Abhi. I think you might
Sorry.
be.
Yes, back on. So as Pat alluded to, right, financial incentives are both pros and cons, right? I mean, it's easy to say, let's pay people, but I'm going to talk about the underlying sort of things on what you can watch out for. So I'm going to come back with the same plot if the slides can cooperate. This survival plot shows a remarkable difference in why the participation engagement is higher in Brighton study. What is not present on the slide, but let me just talk through it. It's really interesting to look at the participation trend, which the paper talks about, and breaks them down into clusters. And you really see a very high proportion relative to other studies of people who are participating daily. That's the key here, right? So if the goal is to ask people more frequently and over longer time, then breaking participant payments and incentives over time is a really good strategy, as long as it's my recommendation that at least it should follow a fair compensation and it should not be coercive. And the links that here I'm talking about here, these presentations papers are really good seminal work in sort of describing how do you sort of plan your payments for participants so it's ethical and it's not coercive. And as I said, it's really helpful if you want to assess people frequently over time, compared to a more burst design sort of studies, which are different in terms of episodic. There it also could help. And now coming to what and how you should do that. If the sample is small, you can sort of manage it manually, but as you tend towards 500 plus people, and depending on your RA capacity, our recommendation would be to think about third-party remote payment gateways. There are many, and again, these are not endorsement, but we have found Amazon gift card API to be simplistic for obvious reasons, because Amazon wants to sell their gift cards, but they could be integrated into your system where you can sort of have a way in which if the participant completes so-and-so task in a week, then they are automatically disbursed a certain dollar amount, and that could be coded out. There are also growing third-party services that are built for researchers to handle incentives broadly, which could include sending a physical gift card or ACH payment or multiple other options, including gift cards from many other companies. So they all have a cost associated with it in terms of administration cost, and you should look into that as well.
So I just want to address lower income populations. This is can be a particular challenge if you really want to have a representative sample or targeting a particular population. Just keep in mind that that lower income communities do have access to smartphones, but there's a couple of limitations here. First off, a lot of smartphones tend to be older generation smartphones, so you'll really need to think about the development. As an example, we were doing a study with students in Central Washington, many of whom are lower income, training them on how to do behavioral interventions. And we had a computerized intelligent tutoring system that we were testing. And we ended up having to design for iPhone 6s, which is almost, it's like really antiquated technology. But kind of keep that in mind that that is kind of that is a tendency to see much older versions of phones. The other challenge too is that there's a tendency to share phones in a family. So it's like we're all used to one person per phone, and I know some people who have two phones, one for work and one for themselves. But in lower income communities, it's usually one phone per family. And so if you're doing sensitive research, you're going to need to be very careful and maybe even ask in your screening, do you share your phone? How much of the time do you carry your phone with you? And then, but then also think ahead of time about what it means for there to be an app on that phone that, like, please don't call it the depression app or mind screener or something like that, because that would be stigmatizing for the individual. Data plans will also limit the ability to participate. So be very mindful of the fact that, you know, it might be harder to do daily surveys with somebody because you're eating up their data plan. And so you think very mindfully about how often and how frequently you want to contact the participant. Telesurvey is possible, but very low income participants do use prepay phones that tend to get you know, changed out periodically. And so if you're doing a longitudinal study, you may lose a group of people just simply because you don't have their new phone number. And then sending incentives may be more complex. In fact, you may have to rethink your whole incentive model, and it might be interesting to do, or important to do, a study first to ask about what would be the right kind of incentives for somebody in lower incomes to participate. So for instance, maybe paying them back for the data that they use to participate in your study may be one way to do that. So it's a little bit more challenging. It's not impossible, but you know, you do have to think about that carefully.
All right, so as we wrap it up, I guess we have covered a lot of ground with some examples on how to sort of transition or hybridize your traditional health research, which is in person and clinic. I just want to sort of emphasize and summarize a few key things here to keep in mind is basically these three things, right? What are you trying to ask and what is the right modality of asking it? Surveys, sensor-based assessments, passive data. We didn't really get into the gory details of what could be done. There's a lot of growing ecosystem around using objective, quote unquote, measures that use sensors on the phone to assess various different modalities, including cognition, gait, etc. A lot of research has been done on passive data, but the underlying need for this is to understand how does that data modality fit into your primary hypothesis, or is that a part of your secondary exploration hypothesis and determine based on that the study protocol. You will also reach out a larger audience no matter what, compared to your in-person recruitment, and your platform should be able to handle that sort of load. And once the participant sort of goes away, they probably will not come back. And then thinking about what's the approach you want to take with the check-in, whether it's in person, given the circumstances, might be difficult, and what if you can have a hybrid sort of Zoom-based or something more secure, even optional check-ins that could help with the retention tremendously. As Pat said, human in the loop can be really helpful. All this have consequences on ethics governance, especially in the real world data, and it's really sort of easy to put a lot of questionnaire that one can get excited about, but doesn't mean that people will respond to all of those. So think about being really parsimonious on that. And last thing is this data will be a very high volume compared to what some of us might be used to. So thinking through as a, not a post hoc, but a pre-thought on how the data will be handled, how the featureization will be done, etc., will be super important.
Okay, so you know, in the last couple of minutes, I'll try to address some of the questions that came up on the chat. And the first one that came up was about IRBs. And I will say that because we have we're so short on time to address all of your questions, that what we're going to do is create a frequently asked questions page to address all of the questions that you came up with. We'll be able to send that out to you, but also post it on our website. But in terms of IRB, you know, I've actually been super surprised. I've had to do this with two universities, UCSF and University of Washington, and I've been surprised about how accommodating they've been. They basically were really good about giving us approval and seeing us studies that we were doing as minimal risk. And the interesting part, though, I think, is that we really thought thoroughly about what we thought the concerns were going to be. And we were able to build on the shoulders of people who do internet-based research, you know, like basically treatment through your computer. That had been going on for at least a decade before we started doing smartphone research. And so we were able to put in a proposal that addressed all of the risks and benefits and how we were going, and risks and how we were going to manage that. And so I think it's helpful to learn when you work with your IRB, show them that there are other people who have been doing this work. I sent in the chat Camille Nebeker's center called Recode Health, where she has done a tremendous amount of work about around how to educate IRBs around digital research. And that's a really good resource that I think could be helpful to a lot of people. The other question that I saw come up was around how to budget for Facebook. And I tried to get my project manager to text back quickly, like, how did we do that again? And she said that Facebook ads cost on average about 30 cents a click. We plan higher than that since introducing parameters like age, geography, etc. increases the costs. Costs per click goes down as the traffic goes up. I asked her if they helped create the budget, and she said, nope, not until you're ready to set up the ad. But you can set up a maximum spend. So if you have a certain budget, you can go ahead and put up like, this is the maximum I'm willing to spend, and they won't overreach that. So just kind of plan for like probably 35 cents per click, knowing that the cost will go down as the traffic hits your website. Let's see, what are some of the other questions that we can get to?
Somebody asked for whether you have advice on recruiting teenagers remotely when you need parents' consent as well.
I'm sorry to say, I do not have experience recruiting adolescents and children through smartphones, but we have colleagues here at Seattle Children's who've done a lot of remote research with kids. And I can get you an answer to that question as part of our FAQs by asking my colleagues here at the Alacrity Center, that would be Aaron Lyon, about how they do consent with kids when you need a parental consent. My guess, based on how companies do this, like message-based care companies or internet-based mental health companies, is that they ask that the parents do a video chat just to prove that the parent has given them consent.
Another question was, do you have any advice for recruiting people who are COVID-19 positive?
Oh gosh. The way that we've been doing that is, there's two ways. One is to ask if they've been tested and how did they test. The other way is to partner up with clinics. And I think Abhi had mentioned how recruitment from clinics is actually a really good way to get a retained sample, to just basically say, hey, we're doing this study to do, like, say, contact tracing. Would you guys be willing to send your, patients a link to our study? So, it's basically like you would do recruitment in primary care, where, they will probably want to talk to you about like the ethics of that, and you have to work on that. But just keep in mind, everybody's a volunteer. So just sending them a link doesn't mean that, you're necessarily bothering them. They can decide not to participate. Any other questions quickly? Recommendations for remote tech approaches for cognitive impairment. I have links to that, or for neuropsych assessment, I have links for that. I do notice that it is 1 minute past our hour, so I'm going to, and people are rolling off. So thank you very much for participating. We will keep we'll keep this open for another couple of minutes so people can type in their questions, and we'll be sending out more information soon. Thank you.
Thank you, everyone. Cheers.